Austrian economics has gained quite a lot of ground on the internet recently. For those of you unaware of it, Austrian economics refers to a certain school of economics that is lauded by so-called voluntarists, free market libertarians, and laissez-faire capitalists. It originates from Vienna, Austria, and there are quite a number of popular economists who subscribe to Austrian methods. To be fair to them, they've made a lot of very good contributions to the field, such as showing how governments can themselves cause monopolies to arise through bad action, and how markets can be a useful tool to serve the greater good. But there's just one problem with it. It doesn't work. Not in theory, not in practice. That's not to say it's refuted. It's a malformed statement to say one can refute an economic theory, because theories are, at the end of the day, just one way of looking at a dilemma. It's important to note that there are a lot of intelligent Austrians, but nowadays the majority of those arguing for it do not reflect that. These people have a very arrogant and immature outlook, captured perfectly by the phrase they have thoroughly killed, basic economics. Ironically, a lot of the Austrians who would go and tell a person they are talking with that they do not understand basic economics understand nothing more than basic economics. Typical Dunning-Kruger effect. These people haven't explored anything more than very surface-level arguments for this one particular school of economics, which is not even taken seriously by the majority of economists in the modern day. They believe they are the only school to have accounted for subjectivism, despite the fact that even Marxian economics is not incompatible with subjective value through use of the mechanism of socially necessary labor, and this ridiculous strawman has pervaded the discourse with every school of economics. But you know what? They are right on one thing. It really is basic. It's so basic. How can you not get it? It's just so basic. And one of the things I'm hoping to show in this video is just how basic these people and this school seem to be. So let's get right into the main problems of Austrian economics, and I'll try to make this video as beginner-friendly as possible, though you may not understand some of the term. The very backbone, the bread and butter of Austrian economics is something called methodological individualism, which means that the assumption is made that all social phenomena can be explained by the actions and behaviors of individuals, and that structure is entirely produced by individuals. This is often contrasted with holism, which assumes that individuals' behaviors and actions are a result of structure, and that we can model behavior as groups of demographics. But this is not a choice we need to make. At the very start of humanity, perhaps, methodological individualism would make sense, but nowadays we are born into a social structure which molds our motives and molds us as agents. So the agent and the structure are mutually dependent, as the individuals reproduce the structure and the structure affects individuals. So individuals make their choices in a pre-existing social context. And this is why it's so important to stress how ahistorical ideologies based on this branch of economics are. It's the same as comparing individualism and collectivism. These two things are not opposed. The structure influences the individual influences the collective. For economic schools that understand this, like post-Keynesianism, meaning is not an objective fact about the world like Austrians must think, but instead a universal which is changed by individuals' interaction with the social structure. This is just common sense. It's methodological individualism which allows for certain ideals within these ideologies, such as the Randian self-made man, to arise. It cannot account for structural influence, and in psychoanalysis this concept is the pinnacle of what is called obsessive behavior, at least according to Maboy Lacan. I've touched upon this elsewhere, but I'd just like to mention briefly how Austrian economics makes the same mistake as all neoclassical economic branches, in assuming that the individual is materialistically self-interested. That is to say that individuals are assumed to never act in the interest of anything but their own wealth, treating it like the ends rather than a means. And this is essentially what Zizek means about capitalism not being egoistic at all in a certain sense, because it treats money and the market as a Lacanian other. If this assumption were true, it would mean that the entirety of the population of the Earth were neurotic en masse. I don't think I need to go into why this is false. It's obviously not the case. Just the concept of altruism alone kills Austrian economics and all neoclassical branches of economics as well. Going on to the last of the most notable theoretical problems, not to say there aren't many more, is the problem of continuity. Both Rothbard and Mises reject the idea of continuity. Rothbard says, human beings act on the basis of things that are relevant to their action. The human being cannot see the infinitely small step. It therefore has no meaning to him and no relevance to his action. This may seem unimportant, but it actually ends up meaning that calculus as a whole becomes impossible in economic calculations. You cannot differentiate a relationship which is not continuous, because for calculus to be used there must be no limit to the smallness of distances. Since there are gaps between parts in a polynomial graph, it is entirely impossible to make a which we can model graph as a straight line relationship, and thus we cannot take a look at vanishing differences with which we can calculate a rate. However, Rothbard's works are filled with supply-demand relationship graphs. But given that there is no continuity under Rothbard's view of things, supply and demand would hardly ever be equal. It's almost impossible. And so even these simple algebraic relationships cannot be used. One can say that they can be close enough to assume they are the same, but that's a double standard, given that Rothbard demands that we don't assume continuity is true. Now let's move on to the practical problems of the school. One of the most popular claims of ideologues who follow Austrian economics is that an increase in minimum wage leads to higher unemployment. Here's a simplified graph explaining the relationship under Austrian theory. Any minimum wage above market wage will supposedly cause unemployment according to this graph, and therefore the argument goes that it is harmful to raise minimum wage above the market wage. The logical conclusion is that there is no point in a minimum wage. But this is simply factually wrong. Here is a graph for America's minimum wage versus the unemployment ratio, and as you can see, it just doesn't change fucking anything. This is a metagraph for 64 studies showing the effects of increases on minimum wage. Fucking nothing. And if you're wondering, by the way, why the minimum wage seems to be decreasing, that's because of inflation. The government has not at all tried to account for inflation in minimum wage, so according to Austrians, employment should be skyrocketing. But it just isn't. It seems to have very minor effects in the long run. So when PragerU says,
raising the minimum wage makes it harder for young and inexperienced workers to get jobs,
I have to wonder where the fuck they're getting their statistical work from. And if you needed some more evidence that shows Austrians are not taken seriously by economists and that the debate is hardly over, here's a petition signed by over 600 economists supporting an increase in minimum wage. I'm not arguing they're right because it's a large number, but these ideologues I'm talking about do not even notice that there is more than one branch of economics. It's widely argued by the right wing in general that the free market is the best way to innovate. Businesses are forced to find a unique selling point, being in a competitive market, so will invest in research and development. Supposedly. But one needs only to look at innovation under Apollo in the USSR and the World Wars to realize that state funding can be just as, if not more, innovative than markets. During the Apollo project, innovation was higher than it ever has been, and after the cancellation, it plummeted. Hitlerite Germany again had far more innovation than a free market would have allowed. It seems like the real reason for innovation is some form of motivation, and whilst it is true that money is a motivation for innovation, and we've seen this with, for example, SpaceX, most of the research is going into completely useless things like selfie sticks. How could a company like SpaceX actually exist without the help from the government like it is currently getting, or pre-existing billionaires, given the high fixed costs? It's called a natural monopoly, and it seems like most of these people are generalizing bad state action as all state action, and it comes across as an unfalsifiable hypothesis they have. It's also often argued that companies like Apple are not really innovating and are able to just trick people into buying more whilst making products designed to break, but one needs to remember that Apple is part of an oligopoly, and so according to Austrians, would not be so large and comfortable under a truly, quote, free market. So I think this argument coming from my own side is a pretty bad one. This brings us on to the question of the validity of the claim made that monopolies could not form under ideologies like, say, anarcho-capitalism. A large number of Austrians actually do admit that monopolies could form under these systems, including Mises himself. And by the way, yes, having no state does not mean there is no system, and don't just take it from me, even Anarchyball thinks that the difference between a state and an anarcho-capitalist society is simply the method of voting.
In America, you vote for rulers who decide what businesses and policies should exist and what shouldn't for you. In an anarcho-capitalist society, we cut out the middleman and let you vote for things directly by letting you vote with your wallet.
Talk about rhetoric. But in any case, because of the existence of deadweight loss, there is always going to be some risk of monopolization. Rothbard never actually argues against this in his book, he just sort of dismisses it, waving his hands. Finally, I want to talk about something called the economic calculation problem, which is supposed to be an argument against socialism mainly. Mises says, if no other objections could be raised to the socialist plans, then that socialism will lower the standard of living of all or at least of the immense majority, it would be impossible for praxeology to pronounce a final judgment. Men would have to decide the issue between capitalism and socialism on the grounds of judgments of value and of judgments of relevance. They would have to choose between the two systems as they choose between many other things. However, the true state of affairs is entirely different. Socialism is not a realizable system of society's economic organization because it lacks any method of economic calculation. Socialism cannot be realized because it is beyond human power to establish it as a social system. Now let's not bother talking about the entire debate on the side of market socialists or hypercomputation, not to be confused with magic computers like most Austrians do when I bring it up, or any of the other main essays that argue against this problem. But there's a more serious flaw in Mises's logic, because he also repeatedly insists that economic theory only gives qualitative and not quantitative data. Therefore, he cannot conclude that socialism would collapse due to being unable to solve economic calculation. He has no idea how severe the problem would be. He is making a quantitative judgment about how necessary economic calculation is. He must choose one claim or the other. He cannot have both. And there is no evidence that it is solely lack of economic calculation that led to the fall of supposedly socialist states, like the USSR. In fact, it's far more likely that it's a lack of democratic accountability, something which should be necessary to even call an economy socialist. Putting the means of production into the hands of a dictator and calling it a day cannot be called a democratic or worker economy. Of course, the amount of historical and empirical evidence I give doesn't matter, because a lot of these Austrians believe that because of their praxeology, they have no need for evidence, just proof of concept. But given the amount of evidence against Austrian economics, one would think that it would be a good idea to check whether the concepts were actually correct in the first place. And I think if they did check, these arrogant assholes would be humbled.